The morning of October 11th, 2025, arrived in Los Angeles with a deceptive calm. The sky was clear, the air unusually gentle, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than accidental. Somewhere behind closed gates and tall trees, Diane Keaton's life came to an end, softly, without spectacle, without the noise that had followed her for more than 5 decades. She was 79 years old. By midday, the news had rippled outward, first through whispers among industry insiders, then through headlines that struggled to capture what had really been lost. An actress, a muse, a woman who had shaped modern cinema without ever surrendering herself to it. What stunned the world was not only her passing, but the echo it triggered. Almost immediately, attention turned to one man who had long existed at the emotional edge of her story: Al Pacino. For years, their names have been linked by memory, by unfinished sentences, by a love story that never quite found its ending. When word reached him, those close by described a reaction stripped of performance or control. He wept. He reportedly repeated a single regret, over and over, as if saying it enough times might loosen its grip. I will regret for the rest of my life not marrying Diane. She was the greatest love of my life. In a culture trained to distrust sincerity, the rawness of that admission cut through everything. The public leaned in, not out of morbid curiosity, but because this confession exposed something uncomfortable and familiar. The idea that even legends run out of time, that even lives framed by applause can collapse into silence, leaving behind questions no one gets to answer. Diane Keaton had spent her career mastering the art of understatement, of turning vulnerability into strength, awkwardness into grace. Her death seemed to follow the same pattern. No grand farewell, no stade goodbye, just absence. As details slowly emerged, they revealed more restraint than revelation. Emergency responders were called early that morning. There were no signs of disturbance, no chaos, no dramatic final scene. Her home, often described as a sanctuary of imagination, remained orderly, almost serene. Hours later, the world learned she was gone. The family confirmed her death but shielded the specifics, choosing privacy over explanation. That decision only deepened the mystery, allowing speculation to bloom in the spaces left intentionally empty. Hollywood reacted the only way it knows how, with memory. Tributes poured in from collaborators, friends, and those she had quietly influenced across generations. They spoke of her timing, her intelligence, her refusal to compete in rooms designed to make women smaller. They recalled the fedora hats, the unpolished laugh, the way she could hold a scene without raising her voice. Yet beneath the praise, something darker lingered, an awareness that Diane Keaton had often stood alone, by choice and by consequence. She never married. She built a life on her own terms, even when those terms came at a cost. That cost now seemed to crystallize in Al Pacino's silence. He did not rush to a podium. He did not attend the funeral. Friends suggested the pain was too heavy, the memories too sharp. Instead, he retreated inward, surrounded by old photographs, letters, and objects that no longer belonged to the present. In his absence, the world projected meaning. Some called it devotion. Others called it regret. What remained undeniable was the sense of an unfinished story pressing against the edges of everything. The image was impossible to ignore. Two actors whose on-screen chemistry redefined intimacy. Two people who circled each other for decades without ever closing the distance. And now, a final separation with no chance for revision. The funeral itself, held quietly days later, became less important than the emotional vacuum around it. Who was there mattered less than who could not bring himself to be. This is where Diane Keaton's story shifts from biography to something more universal. Her death is not only about illness or age or even legacy. It is about the spaces between decisions, about the moments when life asks for certainty and offers no rehearsal. It is about love delayed until it becomes memory, and memory that arrives too late to change anything. As the industry mourned and the audience searched for meaning, one truth settled heavily over everything. Some losses are not loud. They do not announce themselves with drama. They arrive quietly, leaving behind a silence that follows you for the rest of your life. Long before the world began framing Diane Keaton's life around her final silence, there was a woman who never expected to become a symbol at all. Born far from the mythology of Hollywood, she entered adulthood carrying more anxiety than ambition, more doubt than certainty. Acting was not initially a pursuit of fame, but a way to make sense of herself in rooms that often felt too loud and too demanding. From the beginning, she was different. Her presence did not rely on glamour or dominance. Instead, it rested on timing, on restraint, on the courage to appear vulnerable in a profession that rewards armor. Her early years in New York were defined by struggle rather than promise. She lived in small apartments, survived on auditions that rarely turned into offers, and carried a constant fear of being exposed as inadequate. Friends from that period later recalled her habits of self-criticism, the way she rehearsed lines obsessively, not to impress, but to protect herself from failure. This insecurity became part of her internal rhythm. Even when opportunities began to arrive, the unease never fully left. It simply learned how to coexist with success. Broadway was her first proving ground. On stage, she learned discipline and endurance, but also discovered the pressure that would later haunt her. The demand to look a certain way, to shrink herself physically while expanding emotionally, left scars she rarely discussed publicly at the time. These early battles shaped her relationship with her body and her sense of control long before the world knew her name. They also trained her to compartmentalize pain, to keep moving forward even when something inside was breaking quietly. When film entered her life, it did so unexpectedly. She did not fit the traditional mold of a leading lady, and that was precisely what made her unforgettable. Her breakthrough did not arrive as a polished debut, but as a collaboration rooted in creative friction. Working with directors who valued her intelligence as much as her talent, she carved out a space that felt uniquely her own. She brought awkward pauses into romantic scenes, allowed uncertainty to live inside laughter, and made silence feel intentional. Audiences recognized something authentic in that approach, even if they could not articulate why. As her career accelerated, so did the contradictions. Awards, critical praise, and cultural influence grew in parallel with isolation. Fame amplified the parts of her that already felt exposed. Interviews from that period reveal a woman uncomfortable with labels, resistant to being defined by beauty or desirability. She dressed differently, spoke differently, and refused to soften her edges for approval. This resistance earned admiration, but it also set her apart. She was celebrated, yet rarely understood on her own terms. Her personal life reflected the same tension. Relationships were intense, meaningful, and often complicated. She loved deeply, but struggled with permanence. The idea of building a conventional life felt both appealing and suffocating. She wanted intimacy without erasure, connection without surrender. Friends observed that she often hovered between longing and withdrawal, afraid of losing herself in someone else, yet equally afraid of ending up alone. This internal conflict became a quiet through line in her life, influencing decisions she would later revisit with mixed emotions. Motherhood arrived later, not as a replacement for romance, but as an affirmation of independence. Adopting her children in midlife reshaped her priorities and softened some of the loneliness that had followed her for years. She built a home centered on curiosity, creativity, and routine, far from the chaos of premieres and press cycles. Those close to her described a woman who found peace in small rituals, morning walks, books stacked everywhere, handwritten notes left in unexpected places. It was a life deliberately scaled down, designed to protect what mattered most. Yet even as she appeared grounded, the past never fully released its grip. Old relationships lingered as emotional landmarks, not with bitterness, but with unresolved tenderness. She rarely spoke publicly about regret, but her private writings suggest a woman who revisited pivotal moments again and again, not to rewrite them, but to understand them. The cost of choosing independence over certainty weighed on her more heavily with time, especially as the industry around her continued to change. By the later years of her career, Diane Keaton had become a symbol of endurance. She worked selectively, avoided excess, and remained fiercely protective of her privacy. Health challenges emerged gradually, managed quietly, often without public acknowledgement. She did not want to be seen as fragile, nor did she want sympathy to eclipse her work. To those around her, this insistence on normalcy felt both admirable and concerning. She smiled, joked, and deflected worry, even as her physical presence became noticeably thinner, more delicate. This background matters because it reframes her final chapter. Diane Keaton did not arrive at the end of her life as a tragic figure undone by circumstance. She arrived as someone who had spent decades balancing strength and vulnerability, success and solitude. Her death shocked the world because it interrupted a narrative of quiet resilience. It forced people to look back, not just at what she achieved, but at what she carried silently. The applause, the acclaim, the cultural legacy all coexist with a simpler truth. She was a woman who lived deliberately, loved intensely, and accepted the cost of her choices, even when that cost became heavy. The months leading up to Diane Keaton's death unfolded without spectacle, almost deliberately so. To the outside world, she appeared unchanged, still composed, still guarded, still unwilling to let the public see anything other than what she chose to show. Yet beneath that familiar exterior, something was quietly unraveling. Friends would later describe a shift that was difficult to name at the time. Not dramatic, not alarming enough to provoke intervention, but present all the same. A slowing down, a thinning of energy, a subtle retreat from habits that had once anchored her days. She began declining invitations she would previously have accepted without hesitation. Not because she lacked interest, but because the effort felt heavier than before. Long walks shortened, social visits postponed, phone calls unanswered until days later, then returned with warmth and humor, as if nothing had changed. Those closest to her sensed fatigue, but Diane deflected concern with practiced ease. She had spent a lifetime managing perception, and she was not about to surrender that control now. Health had always been a private matter for her. She spoke about illness only when she believed it could serve a purpose, raise awareness, or offer reassurance to others. Otherwise, she endured quietly. In her final year, that instinct intensified. She did not want to be watched with pity. She did not want whispered speculation to replace conversation. Most of all, she did not want her children to feel fear. So she maintained routine, even when routine demanded more than she could comfortably give. Those who saw her during this period noticed physical changes they could not ignore. She appeared smaller, more fragile, as if her body were slowly withdrawing from the space it once occupied so confidently. Yet her mind remained sharp. She joked. She reminisced. She asked questions about other people's lives, rarely volunteering details of her own. This imbalance unsettled friends, who sensed that she was protecting them from a truth she was not ready to share. At the same time, emotional weight began resurfacing in unexpected ways. She revisited old photographs more often, pulling albums from shelves she had not touched in years. She reread journals from earlier decades, pausing over passages written in moments of doubt or longing. These were not acts of despair, but of reckoning, as if she were taking inventory of a life, not to judge it, but to acknowledge its shape. She did not speak of this process aloud, but those around her noticed the objects left out on tables, the quiet afternoons spent alone with memory. It was during this period that the past reasserted itself most powerfully. Conversations drifted back to people who had once mattered deeply, especially the man whose absence would later dominate headlines. She did not express bitterness. If anything, There was a softness in the way she spoke about him, a sense of affection untouched by time. Friends recalled her saying that some loves do not fade because they were never resolved. They simply settle into you and become part of how you move through the world. As her strength diminished, her desire for privacy grew firmer. She reduced public appearances and stepped away from projects that would have required sustained physical commitment. When asked why, she offered practical explanations, never emotional ones. The truth remained contained within her inner circle, and even there, it was fragmented. No one person held the full picture. That fragmentation would later feed confusion, leaving many to ask why the decline seemed so sudden, so quiet, so final. The morning of October 11th arrived without warning. There was no prolonged hospital vigil, no extended goodbye. Emergency services were called early, responding to a situation already beyond intervention. By the time help arrived, Diane Keaton was unresponsive. The calm of her home contrasted sharply with the gravity of the moment, amplifying its unreality. Within hours, she was gone. The shock that followed was immediate and widespread. For those who loved her, it felt abrupt, even cruel. For the public, it felt incomplete. There had been no gradual farewell, no preparation. Only a sudden void where a familiar presence had been. Questions surfaced quickly. What happened? Why now? Why so quietly? The family's decision to withhold detailed explanations was both respected and resented, creating a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. News outlets revisited her known health struggles, searching for clues. Past interviews were replayed, old photographs scrutinized. Each fragment was treated as potential evidence, as if her life could be decoded retroactively. Yet none of it provided a satisfying narrative. There was no singular cause that explained everything. Only accumulation, years of physical strain, emotional endurance, a personality inclined towards silence rather than alarm. Then came Al Pacino's response, which reframed the entire moment. While others issued statements polished by distance, his reaction was described as immediate and devastating. Those close to him said he was inconsolable, shaken not only by the loss, but by the weight of unfinished history. He did not speak publicly in the days that followed. Instead, fragments of his grief surfaced through those around him. Regret, love, a sense that time had closed a door he once believed would always remain open. His absence from the funeral became symbolic, whether intended or not. To some, it suggested grief too personal to perform. To others, it looked like avoidance. In truth, it reflected the same conflict that had defined their relationship decades earlier. Intimacy paired with retreat. Feeling without resolution. Diane Keaton's death did not create this tension. It merely exposed it in its final form. As the industry processed her passing, the focus gradually shifted from how she died to what her death revealed. About the cost of privacy. About the endurance required to live independently in a world that demands explanation. About love that remains powerful precisely because it was never fully lived out. Her final months, once examined closely, did not read as tragedy in the conventional sense. They read as the culmination of a life spent choosing control, even when control came at a price. Her silence, in the end, was not emptiness. It was consistency, a continuation of the same restraint that had shaped her career, her relationships, and her inner life. And in that silence, those left behind were forced to confront something uncomfortable, that not every story offers closure. Some simply stop, leaving the rest to echo in the people who remain. The aftermath of Diane Keaton's death did not unfold with the noise one might expect from the passing of such a towering figure. Instead, it settled slowly, like dust after a collapse that no one saw coming. In Hollywood, where grief is often choreographed and memory packaged into sound bites, her absence created something more unsettling than spectacle. It created a pause. People did not immediately know how to speak about her, because to speak about Diane Keaton honestly required acknowledging contradictions that fame usually smooths over. For her family, The loss was intimate and disorienting. She had been the emotional center of their small world, the architect of routines that quietly held everything together. Her children, raised far from the machinery of celebrity, suddenly found themselves surrounded by attention they had never asked for. They chose silence, not out of indifference, but out of loyalty. Protecting her privacy had been a habit learned early, reinforced by years of watching her draw careful boundaries between herself and the world. In death, those boundaries were honored, even as curiosity pressed hard against them. Among her closest friends, grief manifested less in words than in withdrawal. Several were reported to have canceled public appearances, postponed projects, or retreated from interviews altogether. They spoke privately of shock, not because Diane Keaton's health struggles were unknown, but because she had never allowed those struggles to define her presence. She was the friend who showed up even when tired, the one who listened more than she spoke. Losing her disrupted not only emotional bonds, but the quiet stability she provided to others. The industry response followed a familiar arc, but with an unusual restraint. Tributes emphasized her intelligence rather than her beauty, her originality rather than her awards. Directors spoke of how she changed the rhythm of scenes simply by being still. Actors described how she made space for vulnerability without demanding attention. Yet beneath these professional remembrances, there was a deeper unease. Many admitted privately that her death forced them to confront their own avoidance of rest, of health, of unresolved relationships. Diane Keaton had modeled independence so convincingly that few questioned what it cost her to maintain it. Public reaction mirrored this complexity. Fans revisited her films, not just as entertainment, but as emotional artifacts. Scenes that once felt light now carried weight. Lines delivered casually suddenly sounded like confessions. Her performances were reinterpreted through the lens of loss, revealing layers that had always been there, waiting. Online discussions shifted from nostalgia to reflection. People spoke about loneliness, about choosing careers over intimacy, about the fear of asking for too much from those we love. Her story became a mirror rather than a monument. The most profound impact, however, centered on Al Pacino. His grief was not loud, but it was persistent, and that persistence reshaped the narrative around her death. Friends described him as withdrawn, contemplative, haunted by memory. He did not rush to defend himself against speculation, nor did he attempt to clarify his absence from public rituals. In doing so, he allowed others to project meaning onto his silence. Some interpreted it as guilt, others as devotion. What remained clear was that her death reopened a chapter he had never fully closed. This reopened grief extended beyond personal pain. It reframed their shared history in the public imagination. Their relationship, once viewed as a youthful romance marked by timing issues, was now reconsidered as something more consequential. Commentators spoke of missed chances, of fear disguised as freedom, of love postponed until it becomes untouchable. Diane Keaton's passing did not invent these themes. It amplified them, making them impossible to ignore. The broader consequence was a shift in how her life choices were discussed. For years, her decision not to marry had been framed as empowerment, as a rejection of outdated expectations. After her death, that narrative grew more nuanced. Empowerment remained part of the story, but so did sacrifice. People began asking harder questions. What does independence cost over time? What happens when strength becomes isolation? Diane Keaton had lived on her own terms, but those terms required constant maintenance, constant emotional discipline. Her death invited empathy rather than judgment, complexity rather than slogans. Even the handling of her estate and legacy reflected this careful balance. There were no public disputes, no dramatic revelations. Everything unfolded quietly, as she would have wanted. Her work continued to speak for her, circulating through retrospectives, essays, and renewed interest in her lesser-known projects. Yet something intangible was missing. the sense that she was still out there, observing, commenting, quietly resisting categorization. In the weeks that followed, the initial shock softened into a more enduring sorrow. Not the sharp pain of loss, but the dull ache of recognition. Recognition that time is unforgiving. That relationships do not pause simply because they feel unfinished. That privacy, while protective, can also isolate those who might otherwise step closer. Diane Keaton's death left behind more than grief. It left behind questions that had no clean answers, questions that lingered precisely because they were rooted in lived experience rather than myth. Her impact, then, was not confined to film history or cultural milestones. It reached into the personal lives of those who watched her, worked with her, loved her. It asked them to reconsider what they postpone, what they protect, and what they risk losing by waiting. In that sense, the consequences of her passing extended far beyond mourning. They reshaped conversations, reopened memories, and exposed the quiet costs of a life lived deliberately but alone. Even in the quietest moments of her later life, Diane Keaton's world was filled with stories that few outside her inner circle ever knew. These were not grand scandals or dramatic revelations, but small, intimate acts that revealed the depth of her character and the weight of her experiences. Friends recalled evenings spent in her Los Angeles home, surrounded by books, photographs, and unfinished scripts, where she would speak softly about her past, hinting at regrets and triumphs alike. There was a particular rhythm to these conversations, a cadence that mixed humor with melancholy, laughter with silence. Every gesture, every pause seemed deliberate, as if she were teaching those present how to navigate life with both honesty and restraint. Her children, Dexter and Duke, witnessed these quieter sides of their mother in ways the public could never imagine. Diane nurtured them not only with care, but with subtle lessons about independence, resilience, and the importance of maintaining one's own identity. She created an environment that was simultaneously structured and freeing. Mornings with routines of reading and reflection, afternoons punctuated by walks with her golden retriever Reggie, and evenings that allowed for both work and quiet contemplation. In these routines, she imparted the principles that guided her own life: discipline, curiosity, and the courage to face discomfort without compromise. Among the stories that circulated later were accounts of Diane revisiting old letters and photographs, moments that seemed ordinary yet carried profound emotional resonance. Pacino's presence, or absence, was often the focal point of these reflections. She did not speak bitterly of past heartbreak, but rather with a wistful acknowledgement that some relationships, no matter how transformative, cannot be forced into permanence. Close friends described her thumbing through letters, sometimes smiling at a memory, sometimes letting tears fall silently, honoring the intensity of what had been without needing resolution. These private rituals revealed a woman who lived with emotional honesty, even when it meant revisiting pain that could have been avoided. In addition to personal reflections, Diane remained engaged in subtle forms of mentorship and support for those around her. Younger actors, writers, and collaborators would often find themselves invited into her home, offered advice not in the form of instruction, but as gentle guidance drawn from experience. Reese Witherspoon, for example, recounted how Diane had helped shape her understanding of character work, showing her how to inhabit a role fully without losing oneself in it. Diane's lessons were rarely spoken as directives. They were absorbed through observation, through witnessing how she balanced intensity with playfulness, focus with humor. Yet even these moments of connection carried undercurrents of solitude. Diane had long understood that intimacy came at a cost, and she carefully guarded her inner life. Her relationships were deeply felt, yet selectively revealed. She could be present in a room while maintaining an invisible boundary, a space where she alone decided what could enter. Those who were closest learned to respect that boundary, recognizing it as both a shield and a form of self-preservation. Friends and family described the paradox of being deeply loved by someone who simultaneously seemed unreachable, a tension that shaped every interaction. These private moments were interwoven with her reflections on career and identity. Diane often spoke of the roles that had defined her publicly, acknowledging both the joys and burdens of recognition. She recounted filming iconic scenes with a mixture of pride and humility, never boasting, but always attentive to the craft involved. Behind her humor and seemingly effortless performance lay a meticulous attention to detail, a commitment to authenticity that had guided her choices on set and in life. It was this combination of rigor and openness that allowed her to leave an enduring mark, not only on cinema, but on the people she influenced directly. Her health challenges during these years added an additional layer of complexity to her private reflections. Diane managed both physical frailty and the emotional residue of earlier struggles with resilience. Friends noted her deliberate routines, small adjustments to diet and exercise, and consistent medical care, all carried out with quiet determination. These routines were not performed for visibility or sympathy. They were expressions of her ongoing commitment to life, to maintaining agency in a body that had weathered decades of professional demands and personal stress. Diane's attention to legacy extended beyond her own artistic contributions. She was deliberate in planning her estate and considering the future of her children. Her home, her properties, and the contents within were arranged thoughtfully, a reflection of her values and intentions. She ensured that her children would inherit not only material security, but also a model of thoughtful, principled living. Friends described her conversations about these plans as matter of fact, yet imbued with the gravity of someone who understood that life, however celebrated, is finite. These stories, though quiet, paint a picture of Diane Keaton as someone whose impact was woven into the lives of others in ways subtle yet profound. Her life was not merely a collection of public milestones, but a series of carefully navigated choices, a choreography of presence and restraint, connection and solitude. Each anecdote, each recollection from those who knew her, contributes to a mosaic that captures the richness of her inner life, the complexity of her emotional landscape, and the enduring influence she exerted on those fortunate enough to cross her path. Diane Keaton's life invites reflection not only because of what she accomplished on screen, but because of the way she carried herself through the years, balancing achievement with vulnerability, visibility with privacy. Her legacy is layered, built upon decades of deliberate choices, small and large, each contributing to the portrait of a woman who refused to be constrained by expectation. Friends, family, and colleagues often commented not just on her talent, but on the integrity with which she approached every aspect of life. She measured risk, weighed emotion, and embraced discomfort when it served understanding or growth. Her achievements in film are well documented. Oscar-winning performances, iconic roles that reshape perceptions of women in cinema, and collaborations with some of the most influential directors of her generation. Yet the measure of her life extends beyond awards or screen time. It lives in the nuances, the pauses in dialogue that conveyed as much as words, the subtle gestures that made a scene feel lived rather than performed, the courage to embrace characters that challenged social conventions or revealed intimate truths. These artistic choices mirror her personal ethos, a constant negotiation between exposure and self-preservation. Keaton's relationships, particularly those that defined her emotionally, are inseparable from this legacy. Her love with Al Pacino, spanning years yet never culminating in formal commitment, left an imprint that shaped her approach to intimacy. Friends noted that while she embraced affection, she was cautious with attachment, understanding that giving herself completely to another could erode her own sense of self. This understanding informed the way she raised her children, the way she navigated friendships, and the way she approached mentorship in her later years. It was a measured generosity, a careful balancing act between presence and distance. Motherhood became a defining facet of her life in its own right. Adopting her children later in life, she cultivated an environment that reflected her values: intellectual curiosity, creative exploration, and emotional honesty. She encouraged independence, yet provided a steady anchor, demonstrating that love is not always about proximity, but about support that endures even when unseen. In doing so, she transformed her private world into a space that mirrored the artistic discipline she practiced publicly, a place where care, attention, and authenticity were paramount. Even in her later years, Keaton engaged in work that reinforced her philosophy. Selective roles, personal projects, and mentorships were approached with intention. She chose collaborations that resonated with her sense of purpose and declined those that did not, understanding that maintaining integrity sometimes required stepping away from opportunity. This consistency reflected an underlying principle that had guided her life: to live deliberately, fully, and on her own terms, even if the choice incurred cost or solitude. Health challenges punctuated this period, yet her response was emblematic of her approach to life: quietly persistent, disciplined, and private. She managed treatments, adapted routines, and maintained a presence that belied underlying fragility. Observers noted that she carried herself with a grace that suggested mastery over circumstance, transforming struggle into a form of agency. Her approach to illness mirrored her approach to art and relationships: deliberate, attentive, and deeply personal. The lessons embedded in her life resonate broadly because they confront universal themes: how to balance ambition and intimacy, visibility and privacy, strength and vulnerability. Diane Keaton exemplified a navigation of life that required both courage and restraint, teaching those around her that authenticity is not always loud, that legacy is not always measured by applause, and that influence can be as profound in private acts as in public recognition. Friends and colleagues described this influence in the way it shaped their own decisions, urging them to pursue work and relationships with honesty and to value discretion as a form of strength. Her cultural imprint extends beyond personal anecdotes to how she reshaped the perception of women on screen and in society. By embracing roles that were intelligent, nuanced, and sometimes unconventional, she challenged audiences to see complexity rather than stereotype. Her choices emphasized that humor and seriousness, whimsy and rigor, can coexist without compromise. That blend became part of her enduring appeal, informing a generation of actors, filmmakers, and viewers who recognize her performance as a model for authenticity unburdened by expectation. Ultimately, Diane Keaton's legacy is inseparable from the life she chose to lead. It is a testament to deliberate living, to relationships cultivated with care, to artistic integrity, and to the courage of embracing both visibility and solitude. The lessons she leaves behind are subtle but enduring: that love can be profound even if unfulfilled, that creativity is inseparable from personal truth, and that the measure of a life well lived is often found in the quiet attention one pays to moments both large and small. Her story encourages reflection, asking those who encounter it to consider how they navigate ambition, intimacy, and the passage of time, and how they honor both their public and private selves in the process. The final chapter of Diane Keaton's story is not marked by ceremony, but by resonance. Her passing, while quietly observed, reverberated through the lives of everyone she touched: family, friends, collaborators, and audiences alike. The memorials and tributes, though understated, were layered with meaning. Flowers arranged with care, music chosen for its intimacy rather than grandeur, and words shared in hushed tones reflected the essence of a life that valued authenticity over spectacle. Each gesture at her funeral, no matter how small, became a testament to a woman who had consistently sought depth in every moment. Those closest to her carried forward the lessons she had imparted without fanfare. Dexter and Duke, her children, maintained her routines, her values, and her love for learning and curiosity. Friends continued to speak of her influence on their creative and personal lives, recounting not only her professional guidance, but the emotional intelligence with which she navigated relationships and challenges. Even in death, Diane's approach to life, a careful balance of independence and connection, humor and gravity, control and openness, offered a template for living with integrity. Al Pacino's tribute, though largely private, underscored the emotional weight she carried in the lives of those who loved her deeply. Friends described him reflecting for hours on photographs and letters, revisiting decades of shared experience that were never fully realized. His grief was not performative. It was contemplative, a quiet reckoning with what had been, what could not be, and what would remain. In these private moments, the depth of their bond became clear, not as a conventional romance, but as an enduring influence that shaped both their emotional landscapes and the memories they carried forward. The impact of Diane Keaton's life also extended to the cultural and artistic legacy she left behind. She challenged norms of beauty, timing, and feminine presence on screen, reshaping what it meant to be a leading actress in Hollywood. Her humor, her intelligence, and her nuanced performances created space for women to inhabit roles that were complex, flawed, and fully human. Directors and actors who worked with her frequently remarked on the way she elevated material simply by being present, reminding audiences and colleagues alike that subtlety and attention could create extraordinary impact. Even beyond her work, Diane's choices influenced perceptions of independence, family, and self-possession. By remaining single after profound love, adopting children later in life, and carefully curating her personal environment, she modeled an existence in which autonomy and affection could coexist. The narrative of her life encourages reflection on how one negotiates relationships, career, and personal well-being simultaneously. It illustrates that intentional living often requires sacrifice, careful prioritization, and the courage to embrace solitude without resignation. Her financial acumen, often overlooked, complemented the lessons embedded in her personal and professional life. Through careful management of her estate, properties, and creative endeavors, she ensured stability for her children and maintained control over her legacy. Friends noted that her approach to wealth was consistent with her overall philosophy, thoughtful, deliberate, and reflective of values rather than external pressures. Even as she accumulated success, she remained attentive to the meaning of her choices, investing in projects and spaces that reflected her vision rather than public expectation. As news of her passing circulated, audiences worldwide revisited her body of work, finding new meaning in performances that had once seemed familiar. Every glance, every pause, every whimsical gesture on screen was now read with the knowledge of her mortality, amplifying the poignancy and artistry of what she created. Her life and career became a mirror for reflection, prompting viewers to consider their own relationships, ambitions, and the choices that define who they are over time. Ultimately, Diane Keaton's story is one of quiet endurance, deliberate living, and the interplay of presence and absence. Her death leaves a void, but it also leaves lessons. That love can be profound without permanence, that autonomy can coexist with connection, and that one's legacy is shaped as much by the integrity of private actions as by public achievements. In remembering her, the world is invited to honor not only what she accomplished, but the manner in which she navigated the complexity of a life lived fully on her own terms. Her influence persists, not through spectacle, but through the lasting impression she left on hearts, minds, and the fabric of cinematic history. The resonance of her life is felt in the careful consideration of choices, the acknowledgement of what is valued, and the courage to embrace both vulnerability and strength. As audiences reflect on Diane Keaton, they are reminded that the measure of a life is not only in its public moments, but in the quiet, deliberate, and sometimes unseen ways one shapes the world around them. In this way, Diane Keaton's legacy endures, radiant and unshakable, a model for grace, resilience, an enduring power of a life lived authentically.